afternoon. My name is Aparecida Barbosa, and I would like to introduce our speaker guest. Michael Katz is a Russian language and literature professor at Middlebury College in Vermont, USA, and a Russian literature translator into English, with 12 published translations, including books by Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Chekhov, among others. From 1998 to 24, Professor Katz was Dean of Language Schools and Schools Abroad of the Middlebury College, having as such visited all 5 Middlebury schools in Europe: Spain, France, Italy, Germany, and Russia, as well as having worked diligently to establish new schools in China, in Latin America, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. Currently, Professor Katz is spending one term, March-June 2010, as a Fulbright lecturer at UFSC, offering the seminar The Realist Novel in the World, in the Old World and the New World, under the Pós-Graduação em Inglês e Literatura Correspondente, PGET. In addition, he presented an open seminar on G.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, a Russian perspective. And we'll be presenting another one next June 23rd, called Why Translation Matters, the View of an American Islamist. Certainly, all these activities have been a very valuable contribution to both programs which have been hosting them and those benefiting from Professor Katz's knowledge and experience. We thank him for that and for agreeing to share more of that knowledge and experience by means of this interview with us. And now I would like to ask both of you to introduce yourselves. Please.
Let me start. Okay. So my name is Rafael Matielo. I am an MA candidate at PGET UFSC, and I graduated last year. And my area of research interest, if I could put it this way, is audiovisual and translation studies, and which I am extending in this year in my master's. So beforehand, I would like to thank Professor Katz for having accepted to be here with us today and to share a little bit of his vast knowledge and experience as a published translator. Okay? Sure.
So, my name is Reginaldo Francisco. I undergraduated as a translator, Italian Portuguese and English Portuguese at Unesp, the Universidade Estadual Paulista, at São José do Rio Preto, São Paulo. And now I'm a student at PGET at master's degree level, and I'm carrying out research on the translation of idioms and proverbs, and I'm also a translator. I have some literary and technical translations published, and I thank Professor Katz for being here, and I'll be helping this interview.
Thank you all. I'm very glad to be here and have had a wonderful semester at UFSC and look forward to returning. I'm ready for your questions.
So let's begin. Professor Katz, firstly, what was the driving force behind your move towards translating literature? How did you begin translating in your career?
I did my dissertation on Russian poetry, early 19th century Russian poetry, and had no thoughts at that point of doing any translation, didn't consider myself a translator. I was a teacher of Russian language and literature and a scholar of Russian language and literature. And I was teaching an undergraduate course in the late 70s. And in that, this was for students who didn't know Russian. And we were using works in translation. And there was one work in particular that had never been translated. And I kept mentioning to my students that this was an important novel and I wish somebody would translate it. And one wise student, they are wise, said to me, "Enough already, why don't you translate it?" And I said, "Well, because I'm not a translator. I don't translate." And that was the end of that discussion for a while. And I got to thinking about who was a translator and what was a translator and why wasn't I a translator, and maybe I should become a translator. So I set about reading that book again and thinking about the possibility of translating it, and actually went ahead with it. It took me 2 years. That was the first one that I did. Again, I didn't consider myself a translator and was fortunate enough to get it published easily and also to win a prize. It actually won an award for translation that year, given by the Translation Center at Columbia University. So I was started on my way as a translator by a student's challenge.
Great. Now that you have been a translator for several years, what do you find most gratifying in translating literature?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that all my life I have loved Russian literature. I fell in love with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy when I was 15 years old. And the chance to read these books, to talk about the books, to teach the books, to write about the books, and then to translate the books was always the most exciting thing for me. So I would say number one was to extend this love I have of the literature. The second thing is the language is difficult. It is known to be difficult. And I've been studying the language now for 50 years. I started when I was 15 years old, and I'm 65, and I've been studying it for 50 years. I still don't have it right. But translation gives me the chance to stay involved with the language. I'm still studying the language. Every time I sit down and translate a sentence and have to look in a dictionary or have to think about the grammatical forms, I'm still involved in the process of studying that language. Third, I would say it gives me a chance to share this love of literature with other people who can't read the text in the original, who may not have the desire or the time to learn Russian. It gives me a chance to share my favorite authors, my favorite books with other people. And that's a great pleasure.
Great. And so, what do you find unique in Russian literature that you think it's worth disseminating via translation?
That's not an easy question, especially having spent the past semester reading Portuguese and Brazilian literature with my students. But I reflect on it a lot because we read one Russian novel, and the intensity, I think, the intensity of Russian novels is something that I think is extremely important. The experience which is described in Russian fiction, the dream of a beaten horse in Raskolnikov's Crime and Punishment, or Pierre's encounter with a peasant, Karataev, in Tolstoy's War and Peace, Chekhov's plays. I saw one a couple of weeks ago here done in Portuguese, as crescer más. And even in Portuguese, the intensity of those three sisters' loss as they felt the desperation of their lives. That kind of intensity I don't see when I read a Jane Austen novel, or when I read Madame Bovary, or when I read a German novel. Russians don't waste time on small matters. They go right for the most important questions. So life and death, youth and age, war and peace, love and hate, sex and death, faith and doubt. Russians don't deal with superficial issues. They want big questions, big themes. The characters that one encounters in a Russian novel are extraordinarily vivid and dramatic, and they overwhelm a reader. My students come in and report that they couldn't put the novel down because they just kept turning pages. They want to find out what happens to Raskolnikov for Crime and Punishment after he kills the old lady. How does he live with himself? And 500 pages later, they're still turning the pages to find out how he lives with himself. Russian literature has an interest in psychology that's greater than other literature. So if someone once said to me, can you picture two characters in a Jane Austen novel sitting, looking at each other, drinking cups of tea, and asking questions about the meaning of life and death, or what's the future of Russia? These are questions that Russians ask in every book they write.
All right, so since we've established this beginning, right, how you started, I have to divide myself between the camera and you, right? So it's not an easy position here. Mm-hmm. So how is your relationship with editors? Okay, you've translated, you've accepted the job, you've translated the book, and now you have to deal with editing. How is your relationship with editors?
I have had very little difficulty working with editors. I would say that my relationship with them has been very positive. And the question got me thinking about why that's true. And I think first is that the editors that I've been fortunate to work with respect the art of translation. They understand that it's important to do. Not all their readers, not all their critics, not all the journal editors may understand that, but the editors that I've worked with are recruiting translations. So they want to publish good translations of important works. I'm compulsive about answering their emails or their letters. And they don't like to be kept waiting. So if I get an email from an editor who says, how is it coming? When are you going to be done? How many pages is it? Is the introduction done? I answer right away. I think they really appreciate that. They're on a schedule. We're not on a schedule. They need to know. They have boards of directors. They have accountants. They have budget managers. We don't have that. We just work. But they are a business. And if you can respond to their questions when they come, I stick to a deadline. If I tell them that the book is going to be done by such and such a date, I actually manage to finish it. Mm-hmm. I give myself a nice long deadline, but then I finish it. I don't let it go a month or 2 months over. Again, they have their schedules, they have their business plans, they need to know. And I think the other thing is if a reviewer, they send my things out for review, if a reviewer says something really dumb about my work, I don't lose my temper. I may kick the dog. I may drink a bottle of vodka, but I don't lose my temper with my editor. I calm down and I say, well, she makes a very interesting point. I don't happen to agree with it. And then I explain why I don't agree with it. Whereas some of my colleagues who translate pick up the phone, call the editor and say, that's the dumbest thing anybody's ever done. How can you learn that? And the editor thinks there's an unreasonable translator on the other end of the telephone. He doesn't see my poor dog, or doesn't see the empty vodka bottle, so he thinks I'm reasonable.
Mm-hmm. And Professor, do you get to choose what you want to translate?
I do. Because I don't consider myself first and foremost a translator, I'm a teacher and a researcher, I only translate what interests me. Mm-hmm. And those books tend to be books that have not been translated before, mm-hmm. ever, or they're books that are badly translated, and I think they should be retranslated. My students sometimes refer to them in slightly derogatory terms. That is, I don't always translate the very best works of Russian literature. I aim at a second level of work that hasn't been translated before, or was translated 100 years ago and was badly done. My own graduate students back home refer to these as Professor Katz's list of bad but important novels. Some of the novels are not as good as Anna Karenina and the Brothers Karamazov, that's true. But just because they're not A-plus novels, they might be A-minus novels, or sometimes even B-plus novels, they still deserve to be translated and known by a wider audience. So I choose those novels and I make the proposal. Sometimes I have to persuade editors who have never heard of the book that I'm trying to translate that it's worth publishing. But I've published enough books by now that generally they take my word for it.
And so, would you say that you have a translation methodology, a poetics of translation that you follow in every work, and as a gradual build-up from your career, as your career progressed?
I don't think I have a poetics of translation. I think I would borrow the word prosaics and say that I have a prosaics of translation. First of all, I don't translate poetry, I only translate prose. And secondly, my method of translating is not as elevated or as sophisticated as some people portray that process. So what do? I reread the novel that I'm going to translate. Most of the time, I have read these novels many times, taught them many times. I talk to colleagues about them. I start at the beginning of the book, and it often takes me a day to do the first sentence or the first paragraph, and then a day to do the first page, and then I get into it, and usually can work at the rate of no more than 2 pages a day. I've never done more than 2 pages a day. My work habits are that it's the first thing I do in the morning when I get up. It's when the brain is still working. It's before my wife or my daughter was awake. It's before the telephone rings, before the newspaper comes, before there's any interruptions. So it might be at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. I get up and I work on the translation for an hour or 2 until I've had enough, until somebody else wakes up. And then I go to work, have my breakfast and go to work, doing the rest of my job. But when the brain is clear, that's the way I do it. What I find is if I'm away from it for a while, unlike other scholarship, it doesn't take long to get back into translation. You can pick it up, reread a couple of paragraphs, see where you were, and immediately you can pick it up again. After I finish a draft, I print it out, I edit it. Then I give it to a native speaker of Russian who checks the entire thing against the original. I make a set of corrections. Then I give it to 2 native speakers of English who don't know a word of Russian. And I ask them to read it, and they make suggestions. And I take it back and I correct it again. Then I send it to the publisher, who sends it out to a reader who knows Russian. I get back another series of corrections. I make those changes. Then it goes to a copy editor who makes yet another series of suggestions. I get it back again. By this time, I'm gray, I've lost all my hair, I'm walking with a cane, and 2 or 3 or 4 years after I've started work on a book, it appears in English.
Wow. It's a long time.
It's a long time.
It's a very long
I'm an old guy. It's a long time.
All right.
So, what are the most frequent problems you face when you are translating from Russian into English, and how do you deal with them?
Russian is one of the Slavic languages, the major Slavic language in terms of number of speakers, and is an Indo-European language, and therefore there are considerable similarities with other languages that I know and that you know. However, it diverged early enough in the Slavic territories that there are major differences. And those differences include something as simple as an alphabet, which is different from the Roman Latin alphabet, derived from Greek in the 10th century, a different religious tradition, Old Church Slavonic coming from the Eastern Orthodox Church, which means that Latin was not the common heritage and Catholicism not the common cultural background that it was for the Romance languages. Russian has a set of aspects like Greek. We've talked about whether Portuguese has that, but English certainly doesn't have aspect. And that complicates the matters of verb tenses. Russian names are extremely long, almost as long as Portuguese street signs, I found. And Russians use diminutives when they're referring to characters so that you can never be sure that the character that you're reading about is the same one that you read about on the previous page. The names change. Russian accepts repetition much more readily than English does. The Russian will think nothing of repeating a person's name 3 or 4 times, where English would substitute a pronoun, he or she, or a short form of the name, or the phrase the hero, or the character, or the man, or the woman. Russians will just use the name again and again and again. And the name is long and difficult to read, so the translator has to face the question of whether you stay accurate and repeat the name as many times as the Russian does, or whether you want your text to be readable, in which case you substitute pronouns and periphrases for the name. So each one of these tasks is one that the translator has to face. Russian is highly inflected, 6 cases. English has 3. Most Americans in English don't even know that English has any cases. They think it has none. Russian has 6 cases. Every pronoun, adjective, and noun is declined, so the entire sentence changes. That means there's an awful lot of grammar to learn, but it also means that you can put words anywhere you want to in the sentence and always figure out what goes with what. In English, you can't do that with the word order because nothing is inflected. Hardly anything, rather, is inflected. You have to keep the word order or the sentence doesn't make sense. So these are the issues that Russian presents to a translator.
And what about cultural references, since translation is culture bound? How do you deal with cultural references? Do you like putting footnotes, endnotes, prefaces, and when, how do you use them?
That's another subject that a translator can discuss with an editor. Editors don't like notes, and translators like notes. So I always insist that I have endnotes and hopefully footnotes as well, and some sort of introduction to the text, a chronology of the author's life, a bibliography of other translations of that work and other secondary works of that author. What I do is I translate all the foreign words in the text. There's Russian speakers in the 19th century spoke French. So, especially in a book like War and Peace, about 15% of the book is in French, not in Russian. If I left that all in French, no American student would ever understand. No, read it. They wouldn't read it, and they certainly wouldn't understand it. So what do I do with the French? I'm a Russian translator. Well, I have to translate the French. Where do I put that? If I put that in the back of the book, they're never going to look to the back of the book. So I've got to persuade the editor to put the French on the bottom of the page. I don't want to translate it out of the French. I want them to speak French because that's what they spoke. But it has to be on the page or no one will ever see it. The cultural, historical, literary annotations can all be in the end notes. And for that, the student has to turn to the back. Hopefully they will. They don't always, but they'll turn to the back. I write an introduction that tries to set the work in its cultural context and in its literary context. I don't want it to be a spoiler. I try not to give away the plot in the introduction. If I do, then I put it as an afterword. And I say in the preface, don't read the afterword until you've read the damn book. Read the book first, then read the afterword. I don't know whether anybody does that, but that's what I try to do. Every now and then, if the book is outside my specific field of interests, I'll recruit somebody to write an introduction for me. I translated a book by a woman writer, and I recruited a young woman at Duke University who's in feminist studies to write an introduction explaining how important this book was for women's studies in the 19th century. And I couldn't do that because it's not my field, but I found somebody who had that expertise, and she wrote a very good introduction.
All right. So, translators are never free of any kind of criticism, right? We know that. We cannot ignore this fact, right? So how do you evaluate specifically the role of criticism in relation to, as regards your career, specifically published translations?
I wish there were more of it.
Really?
And I take criticism to mean feedback and reaction, not just insults.
Mm-hmm.
You did a lousy job. Not just that. Unfortunately, reviewers don't pay enough attention to translations. They don't review them very much. And if they happen to review a book that's a translation, they very rarely comment on the translation. My favorite word, I read all these reviews, I clip them, or the publisher sends them to me. And if I'm lucky, there'll be one line, and the line says, this book was translated by so-and-so and is a very supple version. Supple. That's my favorite word. I get that over and over and over again. Supple. It means nothing. I don't know. Supple. It's kind of, if you're flexible, and you do exercises, you can be supple. So they say I'm supple. They can't say I'm accurate because they don't know Russian, so they can't compare it with the original. Mm-hmm. They feel like they have to say something. They could say smooth, but that's it. They never say much more than that. I've never had tremendous praise of a translation. I've never had real criticism of a translation. Nobody's ever said, this is the worst translation. That I write criticism of translations. I published an article in which I compare 3 new versions of Tolstoy's War and Peace, taking passages looking carefully, talking about the strategies each one uses. That's new. With translation studies emerging into its own as a discipline, that kind of criticism is just really happening now. I think from what I hear from my Brazilian colleagues is that that's more advanced in this country than it is back in the US, where people aren't paying attention to translation.
Probably here too.
Right. Yes. My professional journals, my Slavic journals, don't publish reviews of translation. Refuse to. It's just a translation. They say it's just a translation.
Mm-hmm. But you said yourself that you wish there was more of criticism, mm-hmm. because somehow it seems that you implied that it would contribute. But how do you think that it would affect translation itself? More criticism. How do you think that criticism itself could be useful in this sense?
Well, I think it would make me a better translator.
Mm-hmm. In terms of reflection?
Sure. Good to be, I mean, I see it when I get questions back from my readers, or sometimes I get questions from my real readers, the ones who read the published book and who will find me on Google and he'll write to me and he'll say, in your book you say this and such.
They do contact.
Yeah, not a lot, but it's wonderful when they do. You know, somebody is reading your book.
Good.
Great! You know,
hopefully, right?
That's great. That's great. Did he buy it or did he get it for free? He bought it. And not a used copy either, a new copy. I think it would make me a better translator. It would also inspire people to take translation more seriously. If I say to a junior colleague who has a book that he or she is thinking about translating, you know, you really ought to translate that book. A junior colleague says, why? You know, nobody's going to pay any attention to it. It isn't going to be considered for tenure when I come up for tenure. Nobody's going to give me a raise. I'm not going to get rich from doing it. Why should I do it? I say, because it's fun, because students need it, because you can share your love for Russian literature with the rest of the world. They say, you know. It's a hard sell. But if suddenly what we did when we translate is taken seriously and reviewed and compared with other translations, then it elevates the discipline to a status that it doesn't currently have. And I think that would be a good thing.
For sure.
And do you get any feedback from your students?
Yes.
They used to give you this feedback?
They do. They like reading a book that I've translated. They get excited. They ask, some of them ask how I arrived at that solution to a problem, and I bring in the original and explain how it is that I translated a phrase. I think they feel closer to the original text, even though they don't know the language. They know that I know the language, and I'm bringing in the original, and I'm showing them the translation, and I'm saying, this is what the original says, literally, word for word for word, and this is the way I translated it. This is what this piece is about. And I think it's their enthusiasm. That's what got, again, I said that's what got me started at the very beginning. The student who said, why don't you translate it? And now, every now and then, someone says, I'm glad you translated it. That's a good book. I'm glad you made it available to us.
Professor, given this increase in globalization in the world, do you think that somehow globalization has affected translation for the past years? Do you see any change in translation, specifically because of globalization?
I think it's increasing the market for translations. I think that when I read statistics for what percent of books in Brazil are translated versus what percent of books in the United States are translated, it's embarrassing. I mean, the percentage, I thought I had it somewhere, the percentage of books in Brazil is 11%, 12% or something of the things published. In the United States, it's 2%. It's a tiny, tiny, small amount. at least if we aren't translating enough yet into English, other people are translating works with greater frequency. And I think that's as a result of a smaller world and wanting to know more about other people. I think it's going to happen in English too. We are so monolingual. Our view is everybody should learn English, and if they don't, that's their fault. We're certainly not going to learn any foreign languages. The old joke of what do you call somebody who knows 3 languages, trilingual? What do you call somebody who knows 2 languages, bilingual? What do you call somebody who knows 1 language? American. It's not funny, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I spend my whole life fighting that, trying to get people to learn languages, but also translating Russian literature for people who don't have the time, energy to learn Russian. But I think that translation will be better regarded as a result of this interest which we have in each other's languages and cultures. I'm not afraid of global English. Some people are. I'm not afraid of global English. I don't think English is going to push out everything else.
Mm-hmm. So we are still safe regarding
I think we're still
translation.
safe.
Okay.
Right? And I'm still safe as a Russian teacher. Right?
All right. And you presented yourself, and you made it very clear that besides publishing translation, besides working as a translator, you are a professor of translation studies, right?
No, professor of Russian literature
Russian
Russian language.
But somehow you deal with
do.
the teaching of translation
I
in your
do.
courses, right?
Yes.
So what kind of issues do you tend to tackle, do you tend to address in your courses when you have the chance?
The course that I'm teaching here at UFSC, that this man is suffering through at the moment, was first developed for a group of undergraduate students back in Vermont. And the idea was that I wanted to take undergraduates who knew fairly well a language, French, Spanish, German, Japanese, Russian, Swedish, whatever language they came with, and to say to them, we're going to work together and we're going to study this thing called literary translation. I'm not interested in technical translation. Plenty of people are. So we came together, and the first thing we did is look at some translations of the Bible and some translations of Homer's Odyssey, presenting them with several versions of the same passage, Adam and Eve in the garden, or a description of Homer, and asking them which was the best translation. And they said, how can we tell? We don't know classical Greek and we don't know Hebrew. How can we tell? And I said, that's a problem, isn't it? What we do, we select translations of Homer and translations of the Bible to read and study. How do we choose? So we start with those problems where they're completely at a loss as to where to begin, how to read. And we talk about what makes a translation better than another translation. And strange to say, they actually find themselves agreeing with each other that this translation is really better than this translation. Well, how do we know? And we talk at length about that. Then we move on to theories of translation, starting back with the Greeks and coming up to Venuti and modern translation studies. Then we look at essays written by people translating from a variety of languages. What sort of problems did they face? How did they solve them? In Japanese, in Chinese, in Arabic, in Hindi, whatever language they're translating, it doesn't make any difference. How did they solve their problems? Then the last thing we do, as we're doing in this course here, is each student chooses a text from the literature that he or she has studied. And they prepare a translation of it, a literal version first, and then a literary version of it second. They annotate it, and they write an introduction to it. So by the end of the course, each student has a project of anywhere from 8 to 12 pages of his or her own translation. They share it with each other at a workshop. We give each other feedback. They give it to me. I edit and give them questions back. And each student has a product at the end that they can be proud of. Some of them get them published. Some of them send them to online magazines, online journals of translation. There's a very good one called Literature Without Borders, which publishes translations from literatures all over the world. And some of my students have had things accepted by them. So they're able to share their work with a larger public.
Okay. We would like to thank you very much for this interview. Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.